Hi guys, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite books that I read lately, and it has to do with classroom management and restorative justice and things that I get a lot of questions about, and I feel like they are all summed up pretty well in this book. This is called Better Than Carrots or Sticks: Restorative Practices for Positive Classroom Management by Dominic Smith, Douglas Fisher, and Nancy Fry. To be perfectly honest, I don't read a lot of teacher books. I read mostly like history books and more like sociology, stuff like that, but rarely things that are like explicitly teachery. But this one I thought was excellent and I wanted to share it with you. It's not very long. This is a tiny but powerful book that I think can be really helpful in any classroom. So all of this is based on restorative practices, and I am very fortunate. Last year my district brought in trainers to train our whole district in restorative justice and restorative practices. So I've been to the in-person training, and that's why I do like circles with my class every Thursday. I've got a video on that if you want to see how we do it. And this is how I started like learning about restorative practices. But if you don't have the opportunity to go to an in-person training, and it was like 2 full days long, and I still feel like I could learn a lot more. So, not everyone's gonna have the opportunity to go do that, but I really think that this book is a really great like runner-up. And then also, I kind of wish that we had received this book after our training, just as like a follow-up, because it's not the type of training where you like take any kind of notes or anything. It was all interactive, and there were some things that I just couldn't remember, and then when I read this I was like, oh yeah, that's what they talked about. So this is like my little handbook now to remind me of all the things that I learned about restorative practices. So it's a short book, so I just wanted to give you my review of it and just kind of point out a couple of things that I thought were really powerful. So the first thing to get out of the way, I guess, is that they don't really like the term behavior management or classroom management, but that's just the lingo that we usually use as teachers. But they talk about just creating effective learning environments. And they would say that in order to do that, you really need relationships with your students and high quality instruction. So the gist of restorative practices and restorative justice is that it seeks to, first of all, like create strong enough relationships that people don't want to damage those relationships or damage the people that they are in community with. But then when they inevitably do, it's about restoring them back to the community and having them repair the harm that they did cause. So rather than necessarily like suspending kids for offenses or kicking them out of class for offenses, it really seeks to keep them within the community and keep them in the learning environment, but help them to learn to repair harm that they did and reflect on their actions and make a plan for how to change things next time. So it's a pretty different model than what most teachers do, and probably a different model than like we experienced growing up. And a lot of us just repeat like what we saw and how we learned. So this is pretty different, and I would just encourage you to read through this and just kind of think through this. And another thing that's tough is that it's kind of hard to do this in isolation in your own classroom. If your entire school is not doing it, I can see how that would be very, very frustrating. And to be honest, like my whole school doesn't really follow all of these practices, and I wish that they would on like every single level, because I think that they are so worthwhile and so effective. But you can start in your own classroom with some of these things. Okay, so right at the beginning, it does talk about circles. Teachers in the restorative practices movement promote a sense of family in the classroom by having students sit in circles to discuss both curriculum-related topics and non-curricular issues that bear discussing. And we do that every week. We do that on Thursdays. I teach in a circle and we build community in a circle. Restorative practices also focuses on individual conferences to address problematic behavior. And I like that they mention right off the bat that restorative practices are not about letting things go or ignoring when harm has been done. I think that's what some people assume it is, but it's actually much more involved when students misbehave. And we'll get into this in a minute, but Misbehavior can be defined differently as well, but if a student does harm to the learning environment or to other students or to you, that's when things need to be addressed. But kind of underlying that statement is the fact that sometimes we see students as misbehaving when they're not actually causing any harm, so maybe it's really not that big of a deal. The third piece that they talk about is the criminal justice system. There are cases and there are schools where the criminal justice system is actually a part of your discipline system because students are breaking the law, not just breaking the rules in your school. So restorative practices are all about teaching above punishing, teaching students how to do better next time, teaching students how to repair what they've done, teaching students how to deal with their emotions, rather than just punishing them, letting them get angry and, reinforcing the idea that everyone is against them and people just want them out of there, but rather spending the time to teach them how to behave better. As the title would suggest, they kind of reject the idea that like rewards and punishments are the way to go, and they're just more about putting that energy that you would have put into an elaborate rewards or consequences system into developing strong relationships and communities and doing circles and doing individual conferences and helping students work out their differences. Thank goodness, because I can never keep track of all the charts and stuff. I really liked this quote. They cite Toner, who wrote in 1986 that punishment thwarts the development of empathy in children who learn instead to look out for themselves regardless of the effect on others. And I've seen that to be true, where sometimes they're just trying to avoid punishment rather than thinking about how their behavior affects others. And that's always been my concern in my classroom as well. Like when students are talking way too much or being really distracting, it's like, well, the rest of us are trying to learn right now. We have things to do and stuff to learn, and you're getting in the way of that. So that's why you need to change your behavior, not because you're bad or you're, just intrinsically like too loud and too crazy. You need to be a part of what the community is doing. So this is a little bit of a shift for some people. Another thing they talk about is that problematic behaviors signal a student's lack of skills for responding appropriately to difficult situations. My mom is a special ed teacher, and she talks about this a lot as well, that when students are misbehaving, that's a signal to you that they cannot handle the situation that they're in. A lot of students misbehave when they can't do the work that's before them and they're trying to distract from the fact that they can't do it and that they need help, and sometimes it's easier to just be bad than to look stupid. They also talk about how behavior, like all behavior, is communication, and so what are your students communicating to you through this behavior that seems very inappropriate? Let's try to see past that and see what is it that they're trying to communicate. As I go through, I'm just reading you some of my favorite lines from the book. This one says, restorative practices represent a positive step forward in helping all students learn to resolve disagreements, take ownership of their behavior, and engage in acts of empathy and forgiveness. Because that is my goal with my students' behavior. Not so much that there are never interruptions or there are never disagreements or never any behavior issues, but I want students to learn how to deal with being bored, how to deal with not understanding the content, how to deal with being frustrated by your circumstances, or how to deal with having a really rough morning or something going on at home and then having to come to school and figure out how to concentrate or interact with other people. There's so much more to these kids' lives than just sitting in our classrooms in a chair and being quiet, They also talk about invitational education, and they say that involves 4 things: trust, respect, optimism, and intentionality. And that's what we should be striving for in our teaching. And they also write, and yet schools are filled with students who avoid contact with their teachers. Why? We suppose the short answer is that schools are filled with human beings. And that's such an important thing to remember. Our schools are full of human beings. The teachers are human, the students are human, and we are very complex. And we all have a million things going on at once. And it's difficult to get that many people in a room at one time for 185 days in a row, basically, and get things done. They give advice for building trusting relationships, such as knowing students' names. That's so hard for me at the beginning of the year because I have like 150, 160 students, and it takes me a while to learn their names, but that it's so obvious when I don't know their name, and it so instantly crushes them when I forget it. And so that's just something I have to put a ton of intentionality into. So for all of us like middle and high school teachers, that can be a struggle. And they teach at a high school, I believe, all three of these teachers. So they're writing from experience. They quote this great like poem or short story by Sandra Cisneros called Salvador, Late or Early, and I would highly recommend you look that up. There's a really useful student interest survey in here that I tabbed because I want to do that with my students next year. I have my own versions I've done in the past, but I just really liked this one. They talk about home visits, which is, you know, something that seems very old-fashioned to me, and it actually really stresses me out when people talk about doing home visits because I've never done that, to be honest. I can see how it would be so useful, but again, that's got to be like part of your school culture. And I do appreciate that they talk about how you want to get at least 50% of your staff on board with it, and you need to train them effectively and compensate educators for their home visit work. I've never heard people say that before, and I really appreciate that. You need that effective training, and you should be compensated. And it also says to send educators out in pairs and to visit a cross-section of students and just really focus on building relationships. They also talk a lot in this book about the school social worker, and I'm like, who's that? A school social worker? That sounds great, but we don't have one of those. I don't know how many of you have a school social worker, but if we had just one at our school, I can see that they would be busy from dawn till dusk. But I think that's absolutely necessary. I don't understand why schools don't have so many more resources for helping kids out with things that, you know, a social worker would take care of. Blows my mind. But okay, there was only one thing that I read in here that I was just like, I don't agree with this. That usually happens. There's usually at least one thing. Let's see. So they talk about like having lunch with students, which I think is great. I have students in my room for lunch pretty often, a couple days a week. But it said at their school, we purposely did not create a staff lunchroom so that teachers would have the opportunity to eat lunch with students. I completely disagree with that because as you read through this book, you will see that in order for restorative practices and restorative justice to be effective at your school, you have to have incredible trust in your coworkers. You're going to need to build relationships with and know your fellow teachers in order to trust them and in order to create this kind of an environment and a school culture. And I think that sharing a meal with people, having lunch with people, catching a cup of coffee with them in the morning before school is essential to building those relationships with your coworkers. So I think that it is not selfish at all to go into the teacher's lounge and eat with your coworkers and build relationships with them. I haven't been in the teaching field for very long, but some people that I know have worked at a school for 20 years and known those same coworkers for 20 years. Like, that's amazing to me. And if I am at my school for 20 more years and there are people who I don't know very well after those 20 years, that is a shame, and that is on me. We need to know our colleagues and trust them in order to implement any of this. But the rest of it I totally agree with. So they also talk about like hanging the pictures of all of your students in the gym, which we don't have, but somewhere, and have teachers like write something that they know about each student, like underneath each student's picture. And again, this like depends on the size of your school. We can feasibly probably do this, but and then if there are students that like no one knows anything about, then you assign those students to a teacher for the year and make sure that those students are known by somebody on campus. And I love that idea, however it is, you know, that you make that work in your school. I think I would definitely suggest that. Oh, here are some great kind of tenets of social emotional learning: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. And it really gets into teaching empathy, which I think is so important, and being able to offer help to other people and being able to accept help. And all of these things honestly are like important for our students and within our staffs. They do talk about like giving students a voice and constructing the rules and expectations for your class. And I like that they did this at like a high school, I think, because you're gonna have different class expectations for each period. So they gave some examples of those. I feel like that's really hard to to manage when you've got so many different classes, but they do it, so that's pretty cool. They talk about every person's innate need for relatedness, competence, and autonomy. I think that's very true to keep in mind, that those are the things that our students want. They want to be good at their work. They want to be able to relate to people, and they want to be able to do things on their own, but it's our responsibility to help teach them those things. And yes, they learn that at home, but we're the ones that teach them while they're around other people who aren't related to them. So it is our job to teach them to like work in groups and to respect people and to have productive conversation and productive disagreements. So much of this is just great. And they do talk about the value of high and consistent expectations. This is not the kind of school, you know, where there are no rules, it's just that you're teaching students to be able to follow those rules and operate in a community that follows those rules. They made a list of what students wanted from their teachers, and here are a couple of them. Students want teachers to take them seriously. I've definitely seen that. Students want teachers to challenge them to think. That's what I always wanted from my teachers. Students want teachers to nurture their self-respect, to show them they can make a difference, to point them toward their goals, to make them feel important, to build on their interests, tap their creativity, bring out the best in them. And they give you really good examples of ways to do that in your classroom. I also like this way of addressing problematic behavior. They call it the ABCs of behavior. So looking at the antecedents to the behavior itself, and the consequences of the behavior. And again, a lot of these things, like, you know, figuring out when the student is misbehaving or what is going on, and kind of like seeing patterns in students' behavior. This is going to require people who are not also trying to teach like 170 students every single day and cover all of this content. Like, you need your administrators to be helping with a lot of this. It requires that you have a structure, like an infrastructure at your school, where maybe like teams of teachers have all of the same students, so that you can really keep an eye on them and really track like their growth and their behaviors. And you really need your like vice principals to be involved in this. So I can see how people would read this book and be frustrated that their school is not set up in a way to do a lot of these things. But maybe like buy this book for your principal and just like leave it on their desk with a bow and ask them to read it. And I think the more schools that can implement something like this, the better, especially if you do have pretty intense behavior problems at your school. They talk about de-escalation and say all too often adults become too confrontational and assert their power too forcefully. I've definitely been guilty of doing that before, and it's not always necessary. So they give this continuum, just looking at students first, and if that doesn't work, naming, so talking to them quietly and telling them what the behavior problem is, questioning, asking the students what they could be doing instead, or what they should be doing, commanding them to do something else, or directing them to move or to stop or to take a break, or, you know, whatever it is that they need to do next. There are a lot of real life examples in this book of how teachers handled, you know, fights and pushing and shoving and super disrespectful behavior in the classroom, things that can easily escalate and get really out of hand. Or if you're trained in some of these like de-escalation strategies, they can work out well. One of the students at their school said, rules are rules, but you can get another chance. And I like that. I think that's really good. I wrote a lot on this page right here. I took a lot of notes. And this section talks about moving from like remorse to making amends, to repairing damage, and then like truly being sorry and wanting to be a better person, and teaching students to go through that process and those steps. Another suggestion that I thought was really good is to build trust. If there's a student that you're just like everyone's a little bit wary around, it's called the 2 times 10 strategy. Spend 2 minutes talking with a student about anything other than school for 10 consecutive days and see what happens. So a lot of this is very preventative and just trying to establish trust and respect before there's a problem. Let's see, I've just been going through these chapters. I'm on chapter 4 now. It's about peace building and developing a restorative mindset. And they say empowerment is at the center of restorative practices, as evidenced in the principle that all parties involved in a conflict must contribute to its resolution. Victims, offenders, and anyone else even indirectly affected by it. And this got me thinking too, like, what if the victims don't want to be a part of that resolution? So because like you were picked on or you were harmed, now you have to be a part of this rebuilding process. And I think that that's ideal. I think that that's what needs to happen. And what a great life lesson to learn, when you are harmed, how to forgive. I think that this really brings students through the process of forgiveness. People have such a hard time with forgiveness because they think that someone else is getting let off the hook, yet they don't give someone else time or the opportunity to apologize and respond and try to repair that harm. But I did think about that though. Like, what if the person who was harmed does not want to repair that relationship and they don't want to have anything to do with that person anymore? So I don't know, I think that's just something to be aware of. But I think it's very important for people who have done harm to face the person who they've harmed. I think it's very important. Is this still chapter 4? Yeah, they get more into class meetings. So this class meeting thing starts on page 89, so it's a while before they really get to the specifics of this, but there was a lot in here that actually helped me. I'm like, okay, I can streamline my class meetings a little bit more by following some of these things that I had actually forgotten about. The class meetings are for your class, for that period, or your entire class if you teach elementary. So you can address issues that are happening in that period. If there's somebody that's always talking, or content that is really difficult for them, or a test that's coming up, or anything like that. So more practical things. I think that I've been a little bit too lofty with some of my questions that we do in circles. It's more about getting to know the students so that I know them and they know each other. But we should do a little bit more business too, make sure that our class is functioning well. So I'm going to focus more on that next year, and on page 91 they really talk about that. They talk about Socratic Seminars and sequential circles, and having a talking piece, and doing non-sequential circles, fish bowls, all of these things we do in my class, and other teachers that really kind of took to the community circle thing do at my school. So I've seen this in action. It's really good. We do a lot of this with our staff meetings as well. We hold them in circles pretty often. They give some really great sentence starters for dealing with hurt and resentment. So especially when you work in middle school, it can be very difficult for them to express why they're upset, and either they just explode, or they don't want to tell you anything and they kind of shut down. So I feel like a lot of these sentence starters are very helpful, and then they're helpful for teachers as well. Sometimes I don't know what to say to bring out the right information either. So I tabbed every single, page that they had with sample questions and sentence starters and stuff. I don't think that counseling is my calling. I don't think that I'm naturally good at that. I just want people to get over their issues and move on. But as I've learned about this restorative justice and restorative practices, I feel like it's very important. And honestly, I don't think that people taught me these skills very well, and I think that I would have had healthier relationships if I had known how to work through some of these issues as well. So that motivates me to learn to be a better counselor and a better example, and to try to teach my students how to do it. And I'm glad that I have these resources, because honestly it doesn't really come naturally to me. So if you're worried about that, where you're gosh, I just don't know if that's me or that's my strength, it's not mine either. But I feel like I've learned a lot from this book and from the training that I went to. And this is so simple, but we don't do this when kids get in a fight or get mad at each other or go to the office. But just these 5 things: acknowledge their behavior, have a student acknowledge what they did, apologize, express repentance, because sometimes people, I'm sorry you were offended, but they don't say that I regret, I am sorry for doing that. Commit not to repeat the offense again, and offer to make amends. Those are very simple, but things that we don't do. And again, the real life examples that they give in here, this one is an 11th grader who had been caught smoking marijuana at lunch. So they're using these for intense, behavior issues. So if you're yeah, well, that's not going to work at my school. My kids need to learn how to act and learn the consequences of their behavior, and we need to prepare them for real life. This is preparing them for real life by preparing them how to be self-aware and fix their own behavior and interact with other people. So I really get the sense that this would work at any school. Oh, these are the questions that we were given that I need to use with my students more. But what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you have done? In what way have they been affected? And what do you think you might need to do to make things right? So I have that on like a little business card taped to my computer, and I need to do it more. Sometimes I'm like, all right, well, okay, you're good now? Okay, all right, let's move on. And I don't really want to address things and go through it. But if I have those questions on hand, it's a little bit less awkward for me. I think one thing that I kind of learned through this book too is that, gosh, this just requires teachers to have really, really strong character and really strong relationship skills with each other and with students. And that's hard. That's hard to ask of your teachers. And probably some of you are thinking of some teachers right now that don't have strong character or that aren't good at building relationships, and you're realizing like, wow, that's going to be hard for them to be a leader or to be an example. But again, if we want our students to do that, we have to teach them how. So if we want ourselves and our staff to do that, we need training and we need resources and books like this to help us learn how to do it too. So this video has gotten very long and I've pretty much told you everything that's in this book, but I would still recommend that you get it, that maybe you read it with like another colleague, or if you're an administrator, I would highly recommend that you read this book. I really do think that it is life-changing if you're very frustrated with the classroom management in your classroom. And I will warn you though that it's going to require you to do some introspection and to really work on your own skills as a leader and as a community member and as a counselor and somebody who is just in community with other people. So anyway, it's one of my favorites. If you know somebody like graduating and going on to become a teacher very soon, I would suggest this as a gift for them. Even if you've been teaching for a long time, I would suggest this. If you've read it or if you implement restorative practices in your school, please comment down below and let us know how that's working. I'd love to hear success stories or even challenges. This is like truly our job as teachers, to teach content, but also just teach students how to become a member of society and a member of a community. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.